Welcome to the third session of Suitable for Adults, a grown-up look at children's Bible stories. Today we are looking at the story of David and Goliath. We'll take a look at this small part of a much larger story in a minute. But first, here is one more trivia question to test your biblical knowledge. You'll find the answer later in the session.
One little stone went into the sling, and the sling went round and round. And one little stone went into the sling, and the sling went round and round.
Before we get too far into this story, let's again see where it is in the Bible and what type of writing it's listed as. David's story is much more than just the story of his battle with a giant. Unlike the shorter story that are more tidily put together, like Noah and the story of Jonah that we looked at, David's story is laid out in two books of the Bible, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And he also has some writings in Psalms as well. In fact, the famous tale is only about 20% of the story of David. These books are listed as history. Our first book that we looked at, what of Jonah, was listed as prophecy. The second was listed as law, and so we have our third type, which is history. So it's good to know the differences between them so that we can interpret them each differently as they're meant to be. These are an attempt to keep a historical record of the first kings of Israel. We see less of a short parable-like set of stories and more of a chronology or succession of events. The story of David and Goliath is fairly well known from our childhoods and has even taken on secular meanings today about the small overcoming big obstacles. We remember that a young boy came to bring food to his brothers on the battlefield, only to find them in a standoff with the Philistines. David is the brave hero without armor, as a small child, braver than the rest of the army, defeats the champion with just his sling. So let's take a closer look, a more realistic look maybe, at this incredible story. It wasn't uncommon for battles to be fought this way. Sure, there was traditional military style fighting, but as we can see in both Greek literature and mythology, this is something that has happened before, where each side chooses a champion to settle the battle for everyone. So this isn't something that necessarily would have been shocking. It's not necessarily a statement of either side's fear of battle even, or a stalemate. It's just a more diplomatic way of handling a battle in some cases. In fact, the Israelites had been to battle with the Philistines before. King Saul's son, in one of the earlier parts of the book, is the one who attacks the Philistines first in the book of 1 Samuel. And through a series of different events in both going against God's instructions and just poor decision making, Saul ends up losing favor with God as the chosen leader of Israel. It's then that God commands Samuel to anoint another who would be the true king of Israel and pass over Saul. In chapter 16, Samuel anoints David, the youngest son of Jesse, who is from Bethlehem. So that takes us to something more familiar, the city of David. This is where that comes from. Samuel thought that he would be going there to anoint one of Jesse's other sons. In fact, he asked why not the oldest son, who is more handsome and more accomplished and would generally follow suit of a paternal lineage as the first to inherit. But God says no, and says that appearance should not be considered or hereditary lines in this, but to go to the youngest son, because David is a man of his own heart. This also shows consistency in how God tends to work when we think of the many times that Jesus said that the first would be last and the last would be first, or that the meek shall inherit the earth. So here in this case also, the youngest and the smallest was the one to inherit the kingdom. David then enters Saul's service because at this point Saul has lost the spirit of the Lord. And a servant suggests to him, because he's plagued by evil dreams, that David should come and play his harp to him to soothe his spirit. And at that time, David was the shepherd out in the fields that we often like to think about. So David, at this point, has already received God's favor and anointing as future king, and he's already entered the court of Saul. And this is all before we get to that famous battle, before even Goliath is chosen to stand out on the field as the champion. It is in chapter 17 that happens. Now, there are often exaggerations about Goliath. It's stated that he was about 10 feet tall, not quite the size of a small mountain, as my 6-year-old likes to say he was, as she gets that from the exaggerated versions of the story. Still, it would have been very tall, considering the average size of a grown man would have been much smaller than it is today. There's even a paper listed in the National Library of Medicine on the idea of hereditary giantism, and that maybe this would have been a condition that could have been a part of this culture. In the study, it talks about the idea of a pituitary gland disorder that caused this type of giantism that would have been hereditary and passed on down the line. And in research of different biblical texts, we find that the family of Goliath would have likely traced back to the Nephilim. Now, the Nephilim we didn't quite have time to get to in our last segment, but it was mentioned as a race of people during Noah's time, before the ark had been built and before the world had been wiped clean. So this is another reason why with Noah's story, we probably don't think everyone would have perished in that, because we do then have these cultures still listed as having existed once Noah and the ark and the flood is all gone. So the Nephilim are actually even mentioned later in Numbers. They have been characterized as a group of large, extraordinary humans who were great at battle, were heroes. At some points it talks about them losing that status, but that they were feared for their size. And also during some of the accounts of the military battles and sieges, we have some spies finding that there were people of great size listed in the enemy camps, and that's one of the reasons they didn't want to attack. So it wouldn't have necessarily been odd for them to see Goliath at this point, because it's possible that there would have been other giant-like beings or creatures about 10 feet tall or so. This disorder or idea of him possibly having a glandular disorder kind of also helps us understand why David hitting him in the forehead with a stone might have caused him to fall dead. In the paper I was mentioning, they actually said that if someone had that problem and were hit in the head, it would cause paralysis. And so we see that Goliath wasn't killed by the blow, but was actually killed by having his head chopped off later in the story. So this all kind of links together. This shows how it could be possible within our realm of knowledge. Now, what we usually hear about this story is the famous line from David, which casts shame on all those who doubt God's ability to bring the Israelites through this, and he bravely proclaims that with God all things are possible. We learn that even kids can do big things in our world. We learn that this is why David became king, because Saul had said, whoever kills this champion will marry my daughter, and his family will be free of taxes. So it's often assumed that this is the reason why he became king. In truth, it shows the rest of Israel that he is worthy of being king. But we know that the covenant was made beforehand, and that God had said in previous covenants that those who cursed Israel, such as Goliath was doing, would be cursed by God. And David had already been chosen by God to succeed Saul, and even though Saul didn't know it. So the battle was just a public fulfillment of what had already happened between God and David. It was amazing and it was miraculous in our eyes, but it was something they should have known all along would happen, that God already promised that he would conquer those people if they followed by faith, and that God had already chosen David to be the next king. And nothing else would have been particularly miraculous to the people. We also learn beyond that God says that David is a man after his own heart. And because of this, we tend to think that David was sinless, that he was perfect and blameless, and that he is the hero that is the founding of our faith and of the Jewish faith. And that's the reason why Jesus comes from the city of David, is this unbroken line of holy people. But how true is this? There are some long and complicated stories that show that David was not exactly the perfect figure that we picture of him as that young and faithful boy who took on this giant. The stories that follow show that eventually David is promised to be king, and Saul realizes this and becomes jealous. And there are numerous attempts on David's life and numerous times that David spares Saul, even though he could go ahead and take his life. But he knows that Saul is still the anointed leader and can't do that until it is the right time. But there are some things that shows a little bit more of David's character. Though he always tries to do God's will, he makes some really big mistakes. He lies, he manipulates when running away from the jealous Saul. He later, when he becomes king, he rapes Bathsheba, and he has her husband sent to the front lines to be killed. He does later admit that that was probably not the best thing to do, and comes humbly before God about it. But his son also does something similar and rapes somebody. And though David knows that this is wrong and knows that his son should be punished, he spares him. This later even turns his son against him, and they go to battle for a time. So these are not all the actions of a blameless, perfect hero. So what do we do about it? What do we take from that? Here we have this idea of heroizing again, just like we kind of do with Noah, where we like to pretend he's perfect for our own agendas, or we even do with Jonah, even though we know that he disobeyed God at least twice within his story. But when we overlook a person's sin and wrongdoing just because we thought they were God's chosen, and we still do this today, we make dangerous decisions when we do that. We let political figures or sports players or movie stars or even priests get away with a lot because they have a hero status that somehow makes them incapable of being punished for wrong. And we want to protect that good, godly image. But on the other hand, how do we reconcile the idea that God himself said that David was a man after his own heart? And how do we reconcile that Jesus came from the line of David for that reason? We have to remember that we don't necessarily have to throw out all the good for the sake of the bad. We have to look at the whole. the whole picture. This isn't quite the idea of one bad apple rots the bunch. A whole person makes mistakes and is capable of a vast amount of good. David did falter, but he also often asked God to forgive him. He begged God to help him live according to his word and his law. David came to God humbly when he realized his mistakes. And we can use that to evaluate current or past historical figures too. When we look and see, was there a change? Was the good that was accomplished something that we should still remember, even though they were a human who made mistakes within their time? And there are countless people who fall on the yes or the no line. And likewise, that when you start out doing something amazing and good, like Noah, that we do also sometimes falter. So you have to look at the person as a whole. Now, when we discuss this idea of if there was repentance, we can look at David. But we also can go back to God saying that he was made in his image. But again, how do we reconcile that with God saying that he was made after his own heart? God certainly doesn't make these kinds of mistakes. And I think that calls us back to the idea that we are made in God's image. Just as David was after his own heart, we have the ability of choice and freedom, and we have a major capacity to do good. But also, I think when we bring the idea of the heart into it, is that we have the desire, the innate desire for more connection. And God has that desire for connection with us. So when you go through and you read the story of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, what you see is a depiction of humanity. It's one of God's more intimate relationships with a person who makes mistakes and comes humbly back to him, and in that relationship, that push and pull between the two. And we are created in God's image. We're able to overcome obstacles with his help, just like David did. We falter, and we can seek forgiveness. We try to live according to his law, but we don't always make it quite to where we're supposed to be. You see, the problem with seeing all of these biblical figures and all of these historical figures as infallible is that we stop seeing the humanity in the Bible stories. It all becomes fiction. Jonah wasn't perfect. He tried to hide from God. He was angry with him. Noah and his sons weren't perfect. They grumbled about building the ark. They drank. They committed other sins. And David wasn't perfect either. And when we make these Bible stories so exaggerated and all about the heroes, that those who followed God never did anything wrong, we give ourselves an excuse to not be like them. We know we're not perfect. It's kind of like the old line that I've sinned so much that a church would probably fall down if I walked into it. When in reality, we all sin, and we're all meant to come and have that relationship. It doesn't matter how much of a sinner you are. We are all meant, just like the Ninevites, to have God love us and to love God and be in that relationship. It's like saying, well, who am I to tell people about God? I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. But we forget that even our most revered saints within the Catholic faith or within the Bible started out as sinners and continued to make mistakes throughout their life most of the time. And so we use that as a reason to run like Jonah ran from God and what he wants us to do. We let down our guard like Noah and David did, and we re-enter sin and let it re-enter our world because we're not perfect, so what if a little bit happens here and there? But like David, we can be humble and admit our failings, and we can ask God to work miracles in our lives and to make us more modern Jonahs and Davids. When we make these children's stories to be just that, a bedtime story that happened a long time ago, or maybe didn't happen at all, but we can get a good idea of how to live from it, we stop making the Bible real. We forget that there can still be miracles, that we can still lead people to God and show them His love, that God still forgives us even if we make mistakes, and that we can't judge others based on that or judge ourselves too harshly based on that, because it's about building that relationship with God. It's about humbly coming to Him and learning how to live by His law. So I hope that you've gotten at least a little something out of this, that maybe at least you've gotten a little more curious to read these stories for yourselves, because I haven't even been able to cover all of it within these 3 short videos. Make these Bible stories real. Read them again and learn how it applies to you, and that we certainly shouldn't stop the miracles from happening in our world today because we think that these are fictions. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at the email address below, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
And one little stone went into the air and the jug came tumbling